This video on trade liberalisation and how it can influence growth and development is the first in a series that will examine the role that market-orientated strategies can play in influencing economic growth and development. So what do we actually mean by trade liberalisation? Countries liberalise their trade when they remove protectionist trade barriers. Protectionism is the theory or practice of shielding a country's domestic industries from foreign competition. So, by implication, trade liberalisation means removing tariffs, which are indirect taxes that are levied on imported goods only. It also means removing quotas, which are physical limits on the volume of a particular import. Embargoes, which are an outright ban on the sale of a particular import from a particular country. Subsidies, which are given to domestic firms that help them undercut their overseas rivals. That could be both at home in a domestic market or abroad in an export market. Regulations, so this is normally product standards that have been tweaked so that they favour domestic manufacturers over their foreign rivals. Excess bureaucracy at border crossings can act as protectionism because it imposes costs on firms that are trying to sell their products into your market. So liberalising trade would involve simplifying those border crossing procedures so that there's less paperwork and less time delays. And finally, we could get rid of public sector procurement policies that favour domestic manufacturers. So my favourite example of this would be Italy, where you can still see Italian policemen driving around in Lamborghinis. That's an example of a public sector procurement or buying policy that favours domestic manufacturers, in this case Lamborghini, which is an Italian company, and it favours them over Italian taxpayers. There probably are cheaper and better cars than Lamborghinis for policemen to drive around in, but the whole point of this public sector procurement or buying policy is it's designed to divert demand away from imports towards domestically produced substitutes. So how could we construct an argument to the effect that trade liberalisation might help a country to achieve economic growth and development? The first argument is that trade liberalisation creates economic development because it makes economic growth possible. Adam Smith wrote about the benefits of specialisation and the division of labour when writing about a pin factory that he'd seen. If each worker in the factory specialised in only one of the tasks needed to produce a pin, not many pins would be made. But if each worker specialised and focused in on only producing one of the component tasks needed to produce a single pin, then the productivity of labour would be greatly improved and the output of the factory would increase without having to employ any additional workers. So in essence then, what specialisation and division of labour is about is that people should specialise because it increases productivity, and if output per worker increases, more in total can be produced from the labour input. David Ricardo built on Smith's ideas. If specialisation worked at an individual level, Ricardo believed it could also work at the level of the nation state. So rather than trying to produce the full range of goods that consumers wanted, countries should instead specialise in producing the things that they're good at making. This might create an unbalanced economy, but it would create a more productive economy. And If trading partners specialised and swapped goods with each other, consumers could enjoy more in total without sacrificing the range of goods at their disposal. So Ricardo's famous example concerned Portugal and the UK. Both countries could produce either port wine or wheat. Production possibility frontier analysis can be used to illustrate Ricardo's theory of absolute advantage. So again, both countries can produce either wheat or port. So the PPF shown there shows the maximum output combinations of wheat and port that the UK can produce when all its factors of production are fully utilised. Notice here that I've assumed constant marginal opportunity costs in production. So if all factors of production in the UK were employed producing wheat, the UK could produce 100 units. If they put everything into producing port wine, they could only produce 20 units. Portugal's production possibility frontier is different. They've got a hotter climate. So if they put all of their factors of production into producing wheat, they could only produce 30 units. However, if they specialised in producing port, they could produce 120 units. So in the absence of free trade, if citizens in both countries want to consume both wheat and port, factors of production will need to be used to produce both of these products. So let's assume that factors of production in both countries are split evenly between wheat and port production. So we're basically assuming here self-sufficiency and an equal deployment of resources. So we'd be operating halfway down the production possibility frontier in the case of both countries. So if you look at the UK, they would produce an output mix denoted by point A. So at point A, you could produce 10 units of port and 50 units of wheat. So that would be the output of the UK if they opted for self-sufficiency, splitting their factors of production evenly between producing wheat and producing port. If Portugal also went for self-sufficiency, they'd also operate halfway down their PPF, splitting their factors of production evenly between port and wheat production. So at point A, Portugal would produce 160 units of port, and they would produce just 15 units of wheat. So in summary so far then, if we don't have trade liberalisation and we have protectionism and self-sufficiency instead, the UK will produce 50 units of wheat, 10 units of port. Portugal, in contrast, will produce 15 units of wheat and 60 units of port. So if we add up and calculate the combined output of wheat and port in both countries, we would get 65 units of wheat, 50 plus 15, and 70 units of port, 10 plus 60. Now, what Ricardo was basically saying here is that this is dumb. What both countries need to do is liberalise their trade and then start specialising. So you can see here that Britain is far more productive at producing wheat than they are at producing port. So it therefore makes sense for Britain to give up producing port and put all of their factors of production into producing wheat. So if the UK was to do that, they would produce 100 units of wheat, but no units of port, and that's because they've no longer got factors of production in producing port wine. Everything now is being thrown into wheat production. Portugal, in contrast, they're going to give up trying to produce wheat. It's too hot there. They're not very efficient. Factor productivity producing wheat in Portugal is very low. Factor productivity, in contrast, producing pork is a lot better, far higher. So it clearly makes sense for Portugal to produce no wheat and put everything into producing pork. So you can see that if we do that, the combined output of wheat will increase from 65 to 100 units, and also the output of pork was 70, it will now be 120. So the conclusion to draw here is that trade liberalisation facilitates international specialisation and the gains from trade that can be had from specialising according to what you're best at. Without international trade, the UK's diet would be boring because not much grows in our cold, rainy climate. Embargoes and quotas also reduce consumer choice. So therefore, it makes sense to go for trade liberalisation because it will increase utility by providing consumers with a broader range of goods. So trade liberalisation means that we've got access to goods and services from all over the world that enriches our lives. And we'll have a much better chance of being able to maximise our utility if we've got greater choice to spend our limited money incomes on. So we can all cook like both of these guys. Thanks to trade liberalisation, we can access all the wonderful raw materials needed to eat fantastic food. Trade liberalisations enrich the lives of consumers by providing them with greater choice. Trade liberalisation also benefits consumers via lower prices. If you get rid of tariffs, prices will fall. This is exactly what happened in the 19th century in Britain. Two MPs, John Bright and Cobden, decided to lobby Parliament to try to remove what they called corn laws, which were essentially tariffs on imported wheat that made food very expensive. This was a huge problem, especially for the working class who couldn't afford to buy expensive food. By abolishing the corn laws and going for trade liberalisation, food prices fell, and that increased the real incomes of the working poor in cities such as Manchester. So to summarise some of these logic chains then, trade liberalisation encourages countries to ditch wasteful self-sufficiency and instead specialise along the lines of their absolute advantage. That decision to specialise will increase factor productivity. You're no longer using factors of production to produce things that you're not naturally adept at producing, and instead you're putting all of your factors of production into things that you have a natural advantage in producing. So obviously, if all countries do this and liberalise their trade, then the combined output of trading partners will go up. More goods and services will be available for consumers to consume, and that will obviously then lead to material progress and economic development. The second route through is that you say, well, trade liberalisation involves getting rid of tariffs and quotas. So that means that households have got improved access to a wider range of products. So there's more choice. So consumers now have got a far better chance of being able to maximise their utility from their limited money incomes. So again, that leads to material progress and economic development. You can also say that removing tariffs as part of trade liberalisation will reduce the price of imports sold in domestic shops. The fall in prices created by trade liberalisation will enable consumers to buy a greater volume of goods and services with the same nominal income. That will increase domestic consumption, again leading to material progress and economic development. So let's start to evaluate this assertion that trade liberalisation creates economic growth and economic development. When trade is liberalised, tariffs, quotas and other forms of protectionism are abolished. The problem here is that domestic firms might not be able to compete without the assistance of tariffs, quotas, subsidies and other forms of protectionism. So liberalising trade could lead to industrial decline, especially in countries that have got an international competitiveness problem. This could lead to an increase in structural unemployment, the type of unemployment that's caused by a particular industry declining. Structural unemployment is one of the main reasons why Donald Trump was elected in 2016. He promised to reverse this process of industrial decline in America's Rust Belt by promising to make America great again. His plan involved using protectionism to bring manufacturing jobs back to the USA. The same processes of deindustrialisation have also occurred in Britain. In the 1970s, Rochdale, my hometown, was thriving. The town's wealth had been founded on textiles and engineering. However, over the last 30 years, the town has declined. Cheap competition has destroyed jobs. The town council have tried urban regeneration schemes. This has involved building shopping centres. Yes, 3 of them so far. The problem with this approach, at least they've been consistent, their approach is always the same. Let's build another shopping centre. The problem with this approach, though, is sort of threefold. The first is there's just no demand in the town. In the 1980s and 90s, people didn't just lose their jobs, they also lost their incomes, and with it, their ability to buy goods and services. So it's all well and good building shopping centres, but where's the demand going to come from to buy goods and services that are being sold in these shops located in a nice, shiny, brand new shopping centre? Second problem is that to pay for the, three new shopping centres, all of which are largely empty, the town council has been forced into increasing local business taxes, making it even harder for the businesses left to turn a profit and survive. The final problem with the council's strategy of trying to replace manufacturing with retail is that the jobs that have been created in retail are not adequate substitutes for the jobs that they replaced. Retail jobs tend to be low paid and insecure. Jobs in manufacturing were the opposite, relatively well paid, full-time, secure jobs. So you can see how the level of development in the town has declined. And you could argue that this stems from an inability to compete internationally, and protectionists would argue that maybe the town would have fared better had tariffs and quotas been used to keep imports out. Another problem with trade liberalisation is, will your liberalisation be reciprocated by your trading partners? You might open up your domestic market in the hope that your trading partner will reciprocate and do the same for you and open up their market to your exports. But what happens if that doesn't happen? What happens if you give a really nice Christmas present and give open access to your domestic market, if you get a lousy present back in return, very little access to their domestic markets? If that's the case, then what will happen is that your current account balance will probably end up moving to deficit, because import spending will go up as foreign firms have got improved access to your domestic market, but there'll be no additional export income because the markets that you want to export to remain strictly locked up and inaccessible to you due to protectionism on the part of your trading partners. So it's all very well liberalising your trade, but what will the countries do that you're trading with? Will they also open up their markets too? It's often said by dependency theorists that North America and Western Europe specialise in trying to get developing countries to open up their markets, but at the same time keeping the markets of North America and Europe tightly closed with protectionism. You know, a case of do as I say, not as I do. So the West will preach about the virtues of free trade. They'll try to encourage other countries to go for free trade, but they themselves practice domestic protectionism. Another problem with trade liberalisation is that Ricardo's theory doesn't take into account the terms of trade. So if two countries specialise according to their absolute advantage, the combined output of both countries will increase. But the theory doesn't really say anything about how the output gains will be distributed between the two trade partners. So if you took a country like Sri Lanka, they might have an absolute advantage in producing tea. Germany, on the other hand, their absolute advantage might lie with producing high value added manufactured products such as luxury cars. The problem for Sri Lanka is that they might be able to produce huge volumes of tea, but the price of tea on world markets tends to be very, very low. So they'll have to export most of their tea in order to obtain the foreign currency needed to purchase just a handful of German cars, which are comparatively expensive. Germany, on the other hand, the terms of trade are in Germany's favour. Germany doesn't have to export many cars to buy all the tea that it would like to consume. So the moral of the story here is that trade liberalisation will tend to disadvantage countries that are efficient producers of products that sell for low prices on world markets. The specialisation that comes as a consequence of trade liberalisation can cause problems during an emergency, some sort of external shock. So in the case of COVID-19, the UK had given up on producing surgical masks and many pharmaceutical drugs. So when global supply chains broke down, that created shortages of PPE and basic pharmaceutical drugs that were needed in hospitals to treat COVID. So you could argue, well, maybe we should have had some protectionism. Maybe it was a bad idea to go for trade liberalisation, because if we'd have had a domestic industry producing PPE and a wider range of pharmaceutical drugs, we wouldn't have been so badly exposed by the COVID breakdowns in globalised supply chains. Similar sort of arguments were always expressed to me when I was at school that during World War II, Britain nearly starved because we'd made this decision that we were going to import over half the food that we ate in Britain because we weren't particularly great at producing it. That's our comparative advantage lay in producing manufactured goods. So the story goes that Britain nearly lost the war as a result of U-boats torpedoing ships bringing imported food into Britain. So you could argue that maybe trade liberalisation increases strategic risk. Another way of scoring evaluation is to write about what it depends on. So in this case, we could write about what the effects of trade liberalisation depend upon. I'd say one of the main factors that it depends on is the international competitiveness of the country in question. Internationally competitive economies stand to gain most from free trade deals made possible by trade liberalisation. The opposite will be the case for internationally uncompetitive economies. They'll tend to lose out when trade is liberalised because they can't compete. So much like the ABBA song from the 1970s, When it comes to trade liberalisation, perhaps the winner really does take it all. You could also say that the effects of trade liberalisation depend upon an economy's stage of development. So if you went back 20 years, trade liberalisation certainly helped China to escape primary product dependency. So 20, 30 years ago, China was agrarian, producing low-priced primary products. Household incomes were obviously very low. At that stage, China might have had an aspiration to diversify its economy into producing high value-added manufactured goods that sell for much higher prices. Those higher prices make higher incomes possible and a much better standard of living. But the problem is that if you have most of your population earning very little money, how are you actually going to manage to diversify out of primary products into producing expensive stuff like fridge freezers and cars when your own people haven't got the money to buy those products because they don't earn enough themselves? So you're sort of trapped in this cycle of poverty. So the argument here is that for a primary product dependent country, trade liberalisation is really important because it makes export-led growth possible. So the deal is that you open up your economy to foreign competition. You hope that in exchange you'll then gain access to the rich export markets of the developed world. So although Chinese peasants can't afford to purchase the cars and the fridge freezers and the HD TVs and the iPhones that you're now producing, it doesn't matter because you're not going to sell to those people. Trade liberalisation is going to give you a market, a foreign market abroad in Western Europe or America, where people do earn enough to start purchasing the products that you've just begun to make. And this is exactly what happened in China. Trade liberalisation enabled China to gain access to the rich export markets of North America and Western Europe, paving the way for non-inflationary, export-led economic growth. So year after year, China ran trade surpluses. So aggregate demand increased, which increased GDP, which increased material living standards, which created development. It just happened year after year. Every single year, China runs big current account surpluses because they're beginning to export high quality, high value added manufactured goods to the West. So more economic growth. Keep on doing it. Every single year, more aggregate demand growth made possible by a positive X minus M balance. So every year you get short run growth, and that obviously leads to economic development. I guess you could also say that China's one-child policy also helped because the rates of economic growth achieved from this export-led strategy were miles higher than the population growth, which was very low because of the one-child policy. So this all helped to enhance GNI per capita growth. And as you know, GNI per capita is a key component of the HDI. So if GNI per capita goes up, so does the recorded quality of life. So in conclusion, you could argue that trade liberalisation is a good idea because its opposite, protectionism, is a really bad idea. Protectionism prevents creative destruction. When you liberalise trade, firms are forced into being more responsive to the tastes and preferences of the sovereign consumer. Firms that fail to respond lose revenue because they don't attract enough spending votes. That loss of revenue causes losses and those firms will go out of business. On the other hand, firms that do produce things that consumers want will attract more spending votes. That will mean higher revenues and more profits. So trade liberalisation can encourage the movement of factors of production from firms that have gone out of business because they're not making things that consumers want. Those factors of production are then transferred to other firms that are making things that consumers want, and they're also making those things very efficiently at low cost, so they can charge low prices, and obviously those low prices also attract additional spending votes. So trade liberalisation speeds up this process of creative destruction, the transfer of factors of production from firms and industries that don't produce things that consumers want to buy at prices that consumers are prepared to pay, to other industries that do produce things that consumers want and at low prices too. So if you have protectionism, it just impairs this process of creative destruction. Firms that are inefficient, who deserve to die, manage to survive on the basis that they're able to hide away from more efficient competition abroad, because they're protected by tariffs and quotas. So you could argue that in the long run, trade liberalisation will help to promote allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency being a situation where society's scarce factors of production are used in such a way as to ensure that society's total utility is maximised. Keynesians might come back and say, well, look, the problem with that is if you liberalise trade, some firms and industries that are inefficient, they'll go to the wall and jobs will be lost. What I would like to remind you of is sort of Hayek's view that jobs are a means, not an end in themselves. So people are employed not because employment is the goal in itself. They're employed because they produce things of value that consumers, at their own free will, want to buy.